Okay, I guess I will host. Welcome to SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Today is September 3rd, 2024. I think we have a fairly light agenda, I think, although Elmiko wanted to give an update on some of the work he's been doing around Carpenter and Cluster API, I presume. Elmiko.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And yeah, so this is kind of a follow-up from the last meeting we had where I'd proposed this issue about migrating the repo from my own personal GitHub organization into the Kubernetes SIGs organization. And I had done some outreach earlier in the year, specifically to like SIG autoscaling and to the Carpenter working group and the Cluster API community about this work. And it seemed like everyone was in agreement at that time. And so when I put the issue up, there were some plus ones on it, a question from Vince about kind of naming and whatnot. And Fabrizio had some great suggestions about, just kind of getting a few more acknowledgements from the various parties and maybe adding a few more maintainers. So I pinged people on the issue and, I think as normal with the GitHub email stream, like, people might not have seen it or something. So I'm planning in the next week, I will go to the SIG auto scaling meeting and I'll go to the next Carpenter working group meeting and just kind of, bring the topic up there and see if we can get, get some direct contact with those groups. And I don't think this is going to be controversial because we had kind of agreed to it earlier in the year. And then I am also reaching out to add a few more maintainers. Specifically, there are a couple Red Hatters who helped me out along the way. I'm going to see if they're interested in becoming maintainers. And there are also a few members of the Cluster API community who had participated heavily in the Carpenter feature group. And I would like to reach out to them directly to see if they would be willing to be maintainers or if they would like to be. So my hope is that we'll have kind of myself and maybe at least 2 to 4 more other maintainers who are not part of the Cluster API maintainers group as well. And the Cluster API maintainers are added kind of as a backup line in case we need other people who can manipulate the repository. So that's kind of the status of where we're at now. The next steps that I'll take going on after this is probably to start drafting a Cluster API enhancement that talks about the state of where we are now with this provider. And then my hope is that we'll be able to spend like maybe 2 or 3 months experimenting and kind of talking on the enhancement to see if the design we have now is appropriate for the community. And if so, maybe we can help get that enhancement into a published format. And if not, hopefully we'll find a design that works for the community, or we'll learn something new that says we don't want this or something. So that's kind of the state of the world where I'm at currently. And, happy for any questions or comments or anything.
Are there any comments from anyone? I have one, which is, did autoscaling push back or suggest they might want to be a more appropriate home, or what's the story there maybe?
So nothing has really changed with respect to SIG autoscaling. I went to them earlier this year and brought up the notion of, the Cluster API provider. They all kind of agreed that it was okay to take that name in the Kubernetes SIGs. We spoke briefly about the ownership, and I think people agreed that SIG Cluster Lifecycle was probably the right place since we want this to be a Cluster API kind of related project. And since, the Carpenter repository is really more of like a library in Kubernetes SIGs, not a concrete implementation, it seemed to make the most sense.
Great, that makes sense to me.
That said, I will make sure to bring this topic up again when I talk to them next week, just for completeness.
Well, you mentioned just a little bit earlier that you want to draft the Cluster API cap, which is something we discussed previously. Do you anticipate something that is so blocking that it will nullify the creation of the repository? Because we are kind of doing it backwards. We're creating the repo first, and then we are doing the proposal.
I don't think there will be anything that comes up that causes us to negate or, to like completely deprecate the repo. Although it is possible that during the course of our exploration, we decide that this provider is just not going to work. And in that case, I think we would probably want to like remove the repo from Kubernetes SIGs. But the reasoning for creating the proof of concept first and then working on the enhancement is during the design process, there came up multiple kind of alternatives for the way we could implement this. And I think what we would like to do now is be able to allow people to utilize the provider the way it is, and see if it's going to work best for Cluster API. And if it's not, we could adjust the design a little bit. And so this was really meant as like a proof of concept, a place for us to experiment while we work on finalizing a cap to describe the end architecture that we'd like.
Yeah, seems good to me. Thanks.
Fabrizio?
Yeah, I think it is clear to me that we are going through, let me say, iterative improvements also for the design. I just want a clarification about the term provider. So we are using in this group to think about provider with the mindset of copy provider, so something that abides to a contract, etc., etc. But I think that in this case, what this project is developing is a binary that will be called by Carpenter. So it is not a provider in the copy sense. Am I correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Fabrizio. And I think you're right. The use of the word provider is slightly overloaded here. The best way to describe this is that this is a concrete implementation of Carpenter for Cluster API. And the name that I chose, the Carpenter Provider Cluster API, follows the naming pattern that the other Carpenter implementations have taken. So the AWS one they call Carpenter Provider AWS, and the Azure one is called Carpenter Provider Azure. And I presume there's a group that was working on a GCP version as well. And I think they were going to call theirs like Carpenter Provider GCP. So this is kind of following in the naming of the Carpenter project. But the most accurate description is that it is a concrete implementation of Carpenter that is for the Cluster API infrastructure, basically.
Okay, maybe in the home page, in the README, you could add a note that provider is used in this sense, which could help folks looking at this, and also help folks to understand why we are sort of diverging from the copy naming convention.
Absolutely.
But yeah, let me say, I'm fine with moving on. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that it's, if let me ask a question before the other providers for Carpenter providers for AWS and Azure are owned by whom?
They're owned respectively by AWS and by Azure. So they're in those GitHub organizations. They are not owned by Kubernetes SIGs.
They are not owned by the SIG. Okay, so this is the first Carpenter provider that come up, because really being a binary for Carpenter, it is sitting in the middle, but it seems to me that it's more on the Carpenter side. But it is an experimentation. I'm fine to start hosting it in under our umbrella, and then eventually move it later under another SIG's responsibility. I think that what you really need is to get unblocked, to get folks start using, and to get possibly more contributors, so things will make progress faster. So I'm okay moving on.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Fabrizio. But I'll make one note here in that the binary that is produced from this is the Carpenter binary. It's not called by anything else. It is Carpenter all in one. And anecdotally, I've talked to people in the community who have already started experimenting with this provider, and they're using it with they've tried it out with Cap V and with Kappa so far. So like people are already starting to experiment, and some of the requests I'm getting are to move it to the Kubernetes SIGs or some more public place that's not my private repo, so that we could maybe start to have a good history of issues and a place where people could contribute that isn't, that's more linked to CNCF than it is to like, Elmiko's personal code factory or whatever.
If eventually some of these projects that are already in private corporate repositories, organizations, they get donated to SIG autoscaling, we have already this is not going to be a precedence for us to donate a sub-project to another SIG. We actually did it recently with it was more of a migration of repository, but yeah, this is possible, moving project from one SIG to another. Yeah. In terms of the word provider, it has been very contagious in the history of Kubernetes. I remember at some point in test infra, in the test infra repository, everything was a provider. In KK, everything was a provider. So it seems like people are using provider everywhere. You could say that it's like a cluster API focused implementation of Carpenter, slightly longer than that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the other way to call it would be like, Carpenter implementation cluster API, or the kind of metaphor that I use in my head is that, a Carpenter wants to talk to some infrastructure provider, right? So in the case of the AWS version, it talks directly to the AWS, metadata servers, and likewise in Azure. So the cluster API provider, like cluster API is the infrastructure provider that this Carpenter knows how to talk to. So when we look at the code in the repository today, most of the code is cluster API specific, with the Carpenter core logic being brought in through the library. So I would expect in the future, if there's maintenance to be done on the actual auto scaling bits, those will be done on the Carpenter core library, and we'll bring them in through dependency updates into this implementation. And if there is work that needs to be fixed in this implementation, it will mostly be focused around cluster API specific interactions. So it won't necessarily have to do with the core of Carpenter's code. It will have to do more with how we interact between the core of Carpenter and the cluster API the cluster API infrastructure, as it were.
So how is the status of Carpenter as a library? Is it well maintained? Does it have good separation of modules, etc.?
It is well maintained. They've just released the 1.0.0 version after going through, I think, about 2 years of growth. So they jumped from, I think, 0.39, and they decided to do a 1.0 release. And I don't know if they've taken their APIs into V1 yet. They might be V1 beta 1 still. But there is a good core of implementers there, and they have regular meetings, and it seems like the community is relatively healthy. And it is the common logic that lies between the AWS and the Azure Carpenter implementations currently. So in the upstream community, we see a lot of involvement from AWS and from Azure. And also there is a large user community that's starting to grow at those meetings as well.
Okay. Thanks for the details. Trying to understand the ticket now, we have to get to the auto-scaling people to give +1 on the ticket.
Yes, and the Carpenter people as well. So I'm gonna, in the next, probably it will take at least a week or a week and a half maybe, because the next SIG auto scaling meeting will be on Monday. And I believe the next Carpenter meetings, they're on Monday as well. So next Monday, I should have a chance to talk with the SIG auto scaling leads and with the Carpenter maintainers. And then hopefully sometime that week, we could get them to comment on the issue. And I am also going to be reaching out starting this week to some other maintainers to see if they would like to add themselves to the list of maintainers on the issue. So my goal, I guess, is to get the issue updated kind of before the middle of next week with everything that we're looking for. And then hopefully, within the next few weeks, we could get it approved.
Yeah, okay. Just you can try giving me back a ping when, like, I guess we have sufficient visibility from those groups. Because we put pretty much the ticket on hold. I see that GitHub admin people saw my message that we are not ready to create this repository. So my point is, give me a ping and I will try to notify people like Christoph Blecker or Priyanka, who are GitHub admins.
Awesome. I will do that, Lubomir. Thank you.
Right. Thanks.
If that's the end of that topic, are there any other topics people would like to bring up? That's the end of our agenda, I think, unless anyone would like to say hello or has any other topics.
Does anybody know what's going on with KubeCon?
In what sense, Lubomir? Are we submitting any? Sorry, go on.
I have not submitted anything. Has anybody submitted anything? Also, I don't think I have feedback from sub-projects trying to submit.
Yes.
We have. Go ahead, Fabrizio.
Yeah, I think we are saying the same. So the
Yeah.
talk about cluster API deep dive has been accepted in maintainer track.
We also have one, myself and Cyprian Hackman are doing a sort of information gathering about bare metal requirements from the 4 COPs, but or KOPs, but by no means restricted to that. Like, it's more of a, here are some different ways we could approach bare metal. Which ones resonate most with you? So I think we'll have some presence at KubeCon, I guess.
Maybe some of the sub-projects submitted, but we just don't have the feedback, which is a bit, something that we should improve potentially. I will add the notes that we have these 2 sessions in the agenda, so that we briefly mentioned it.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other things people want to discuss?
I just wanted to say a quick hello. This is the first meeting that I've joined. I'm Cam Carter. I'm one of the product managers over at Rancher, and specifically working on our cluster API implementation. So I just wanted to say hi. And hopefully I'll be able to drop in on these meetings more often and see what's going on with this group.
Awesome. Great to have you, and you are very welcome.
Thank you so much.
Is, for my information, excuse me if everyone else knows, is the cluster API provider for Rancher, is that a Kubernetes SIGs project, or what is the status of that?
We currently have an operator, which is the main way that we're going to pull in upstream providers into Rancher. And then we also have a CAPI provider, Rancher, but primarily the team I work with is maintaining Rancher Turtles, which is our a code name for the project, to basically bring in upstream providers into Rancher.
Awesome. That makes sense. Thank you so much, and welcome.
Thanks.
Any other topics, or do people want to get about half an hour plus back? Going once, going twice. All right. I wish everyone a happy Tuesday and a wonderful week, and see everyone in 2 weeks or at the appropriate sub-project meetings.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.